Cynthia, can you tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in 1953, and I was born in Georgetown, Guyana, which then was British Guyana.
Right.
So it was essentially a British colony on South America, but part of the West Indies, seen as culturally as part of the West Indies, although it's the only English-speaking country in South America.
Right. That's at the very top of South America.
It is, that's right.
And can you tell me something about your mother and father?
Yes, I mean, it was sort of a circumstance really that meant I was born there, because my parents actually met in England. So my father, Frederick, was studying in the United States just before the Second World War, and he came across, it was drafted from America, and he came across as a GI, as American GI, in the wartime, and he met my mother in England. And my mother, English, born in Bewdley in Worcestershire, and they met and fell in love during the wartime.
What was your father actually doing in the war?
So my father was a linguist, so he was a technical corporal and an interpreter, and he was of African heritage, clearly from that part of the world, and a black man, and my mother was involved in nursing, and the story they told us as children was that she was driving an ambulance and knocked him down in the Blitz. So she couldn't drive afterwards anyway, so I'm not sure how she came to be driving an ambulance in the first place. Yeah. But that was the sort of story that we were brought up on when we were little. And so the first part of their marriage was in England, and my sister was born in England. But after the war, it was very difficult for my father, with his heritage, to obtain work. So they decided to go back to South America to try and see what it'd be like over there. And they hit different problems there. Right. But I was born while they were back in Guyana.
Right. So did he face prejudice while he was here because of the colour of his skin?
That's right, yes. And of course, it was before the Windrush generation, technically before the arrival of the Windrush, although in coming back to England I became a member of the Windrush generation, but that's perhaps a little bit further on. But at that stage, people weren't used to people of colour, and it was, I think, during wartime, people were welcomed, particularly by British people. But after the war, it was sort of, are you still here? Why don't you go back to where you come from? So that sort of level of prejudice really was significant at that point. I think during the war it was also difficult because he'd come as an American soldier, and there was segregation within the armed forces, the American armed forces. And also the black American men that fell in love with English girls weren't allowed to marry. It was forbidden by the American system. So the girls didn't go back to America as they did if they were white soldiers. So this group of families was actually followed up by a social historian called Professor Lucy Bland, and she's published a book called Brown Babies, which followed what happened to some of the children who were born of black GIs to white mothers in the war. And our family, we were the only ones where the parents married, because of course they weren't under those same restrictions.
American.
No, not American, yeah. But many of those children were taken into care and weren't brought up by their own families. And some of them didn't know their fathers at all.
No.
So I was very fortunate, I had a very strong, protective childhood. And so when they went to Guyana, of course that was a British colony, and my mother was lovely, and there's a picture of her wearing a lovely big picture hat in South America with my sister, and she was invited to parties at the governor's residence, but my father wasn't. So there was a divide there as well. And then the political system was quite challenging at the time, and they decided to come back to the UK. So we came back, as my mother said, on a big ship in 1956, and I was 2.5 then. And subsequently, that although I didn't know obviously at the time or subsequently, it made me a member of the Windrush generation,
Right.
just sort of coming to the UK on a
Explain
ship.
about the Windrush then.
Yes, well, the Windrush is the name of a ship, and that really was a demarcation really of the arrival in numbers of people from the West Indies, and they came in response to a call from the UK to help rebuild the country after the war. And it was the people from the West Indies, from Jamaica, all different islands, also from Guyana, came across, and many of them had been soldiers in the war, so they knew what England was like. And I think it was, imagine the picture of the young men, tall and upright and very smartly dressed. And they brought, some of them had families there, and the children came often on the documents of their parents. So there were landing cards that were given to them, and it was only subsequently that we understood that the landing cards were taken away and actually later destroyed.
Right, yes.
And it meant that they didn't have evidence
It was a Theresa May
of
type,
their
yeah.
arrival, part of the sort of hostile environment, really.
Mm.
And they had to, those young people were then, by the time this scandal erupted, were much older. Some of them were pensioners, and they were asked to document for every year of their life that they'd lived in England continuously. And in 1971, Guyana stopped being a colony, and I have a sort of naturalisation certificate. My father and myself were naturalised. So not everyone did that, because unless you needed a passport or a reason for actually going to get your documents. So some of those, what were then young people, didn't have any documentation. And I tried doing what they were asked to do, to document every year of my life. And I contacted my primary school, and of course they hadn't got any records, So the house that I'd lived in was a Victorian, what they call sort of back-to-backs in those days. That's right, and I think there's one being preserved by the National Trust in Birmingham. But essentially they were all cleared. They were all cleared in the part of the post-war building. So the place we lived in, the school I went to, the primary school, none of that was there.
Right.
So I couldn't document it, my continuous residence. So it really sort of chimed with me very much, the extraordinary difficulties that people had had, and some of them had been sent back and they didn't know the places at all, and they'd had their pensions taken away and access to healthcare. So I think the sort of othering of that generation really reflected what was then seen as a hostile environment, and we have seen subsequent examples. So by coming back on the boat in 1956, I'd become a member of the Windrush generation, and subsequently was able to make contributions. And
So where did you come to?
The boat, I think, came into Southampton, although my mother was from Bewdley in Worcestershire, and so they made their way back up to the West Midlands. And as a family, they settled in Birmingham. And so that's where I was raised, really, primary and secondary school. Secondary school being Swanshurst.
Yes. And how did you find it?
Well, of course, at that age, it was, as a child, you accept the environment in which you're brought up, really. It was much more difficult for my sister because she was 7 years older than I was, and it was a big change for her. Everybody said how cold it was, and she felt it particularly. It was quite difficult, really, in lots of ways, because there weren't people necessarily that looked like us, so many, and our family was quite protective and aware of the challenges. So, and of course it was before the Race Relations Act, and overt racism was allowed, really, and was commonly known in the 50s and 60s and part of life. So I know my mother told me when I was 5 and I came back from my primary school and my front teeth had all been knocked out, and I came back and said, "What's a Cullen girl?" So you learn things as you go, really.
Who knocked the teeth out?
I was just pinned against the wall and knocked and punched in the face by an older child.
And this is infant school, isn't it?
Yes, it was, yeah, absolutely. So I think, I mean, we're very fortunate. We've moved on a long way since those days, and overt racism is rarely encountered, but it's subtle and different now, I think. So I think those early years give you a sort of resilience, really. You learn how to deal with things. And my parents were very straightforward and really said people who have those views are to be pitied, really, that, you know, it's their problem, not yours. It did mean that I was quite strongly protected, I suppose, and they didn't have much money at all. And when I was little, we lived in one room. And then I came across, when my mother had died, it was sort of a council book, really, showing how they'd got points to get a council house. And part of that was my father's war service. And then, so when I was 13, we got a council house, which was a masonette near Bartley Green, we were talking about the other day, weren't we? And that was the first time we'd had an inside toilet and bathroom and everything.
So what was the previous house like then?
The previous house was it was a back-to-back, so it's an unusual house that doesn't really exist anymore, but it went up an entry and it opened into a courtyard that was a stone courtyard, cobbled, and the houses were 3 rooms, sort of a ground floor room, first floor and second floor, and there was a cellar. At the top of the cellar steps was a cold water tap, and there wasn't a kitchen, but there was a tap and I think some sort of hob or something, stove, and then there was no bathroom, and you shared a toilet block with the 8 or 10 other families in the yard, and there was no garden, and you put your washing out in the middle of the courtyard.
It begs the question as to how on earth you got to grammar school, because you know it was very difficult in Birmingham to get a grammar school place. I think it was something like 20% of pupils, if that, got to grammar school. You know, so how on earth did you, with all those difficulties, with hardly any rooms to sleep or whatever in, get to grammar school?
Well, I think, as I said, you know, I found our home was very supportive. We didn't have any money, but lots of people didn't have any money, really. In the school holidays, when my parents were both working, they used to put me in the public library because it was safe and dry, and you used to go in with a sandwich. You technically weren't supposed to eat in libraries in those days. But so I used to spend the day reading books and enjoyed that. So I did have support at home, and then I had a fantastic primary school, which was Christchurch Primary School. So it was a church school in the area we lived in, which was Borstal Heath, and the teachers I particularly remember, it was sort of 50s, early 60s, and I think probably today you'd call them colourblind, really. They saw children in terms of their abilities. They didn't see them in terms of colour. So it was a poor neighbourhood, but those children who seemed to have the ability, they did actually spend extra time with. So we got extra tuition, really. So I had a very supportive school environment and a supportive home environment. And also, my father was very committed to education. He saw education as the route out of difficulty, really. And I think that's true. I think of that generation, the social mobility that came about was for those who got to grammar school, I think, in a way. It was a ticket. I mean, it was, yeah. I don't think we were particularly aware of it, but it's what shaped my future. So it was the support from the primary school teachers, and then when I got to secondary school, again, you know, great teaching and support there. So teachers were very important in me being able to go forward.
As we were in Swanshurst School, I better ask you, what are your memories of Swanshurst?
Well, it's been great today. I mean, we've been talking to the pupils, and we've also had an opportunity to walk around and recognise so many of the buildings and the layout and the space. Coming from a small church school, it was just huge. But it was quite a formal school in many ways, as grammar schools were then, I think. You had to kneel down and look at the length of your skirt and had to be a certain length, and of course that was the 60s, and you did sort of, when you stood up again, you rolled your skirt up. So in that sense it was formal. We did Latin, and you know, so it had a formal curriculum. it opened up opportunities for us. I did German, and we went to Germany, and went to the Rhine Valley, and did French,
Right.
and remember doing Latin with the teachers we were talking about.
Miss Rosser.
Miss Rosser, that's right.
Yes.
Remember Rosser and the Gallic Wars and all that.
Yes.
And so it was a formal grammar school education, really. And then I enjoyed art and also enjoyed science, and had a fantastic biology teacher in the sixth form, Miss Lacani. She was very supportive. So I got encouragement there as well. And then ultimately chose to do the 3 sciences.
Right. Did you, when you chose the 3 sciences, was dentistry already in your mind? Or was
Well, it was then dentistry and medicine, really. They sort of went
Right.
hand in hand, I think. And so I think part of the thinking then, which has probably changed now, but then in many ways, university was a sort of was a luxury thing to be able to do. It was a fantastic opportunity, and I think we thought probably more about the output than actually ending up qualified to do something. So in some ways, you didn't have the luxury of just going to university and perhaps doing something that didn't have a definite output that you could see. Although obviously, my understanding of that's changed radically, and it's not something I necessarily think about now. I think in many ways, making a choice at sort of 16, 17, about what you're going to do for your whole life is
impossible?
it's impossible, really. Yes, I was very fortunate it worked out for me, but it's not necessarily something I'd recommend
No.
for everyone. And
Yes.
something we were talking about with the pupils today, that if you end up starting something and you get into your first year at university, you're not happy. The understanding that you can change, something I wasn't aware of really, but as I spent my career in academic environments in universities, very conscious of people not losing out. So I think you're fortunate if you can make those decisions early on, but if they're not the right ones, to be able to not lose your place and to change into something else that's more suited.
And why did you choose Manchester, which is where...
Well, it was one of those situations where I had a friend who was at Manchester, so I think... Again, we'd probably have a lot more careers advice and choosing universities, but it was probably more to do with who I knew then.
Right.
And it was a tremendous choice in many ways, but again, it was more chance than planning, I think is probably fair to say.
Yes. Did you go to, did you do an elective? I know
Well,
later they did.
I did a an elective project. I didn't go abroad or anything.
Right.
We didn't have that sort of funding really. But I did a really nice project in a school. We were actually looking at the age a child can brush their teeth. So that was very good, and actually ended up as an area that I carried on working in, interestingly enough. So it was quite formative in many ways.
Yes.
And it was after that project, when I was doing my house job, that the professor of paediatric dentistry, Phil Holloway, asked me if I would consider doing a PhD.
Right.
So I didn't know what a PhD was.
No.
But it meant unusually. I started a PhD, straight after my house job.
Because, from my little brain, I'm thinking of, you do a BSc, then you might go BDA, then you go on to an MSc.
Yes.
But you went the level above, which is
I
the
did.
PhD.
Yes,
so
I did.
You missed out the master's stage.
Yes. I came back later on, many years later, to do a master's, but that was a different situation when I was at Dundee and decided to do an MBA because I hadn't got any really business training. But at that time, when I was sort of in my 20s, I had the opportunity to do the PhD. It was an unusual organisation then because Manchester was the only place that had a research unit that was co-funded by Commerce. It was actually Colgate-Palmolive that co-funded and set up the unit with Phil Holloway and Graham Davis, and there were several people that went through that unit that went on to be professors and chief dental officers. So it was a very productive research group, actually.
I think I ought to take you back to when you first started there. How many people were in that on the course with you?
Well, unusually, there'd been a mistake by the admissions student. They admitted just over, I think it was something like 80 or sort of in the high 70s. And we knew it should have been about 50. So we were quite worried then. Well, I was particularly. There were lots of rumours that they would change the pass mark for the first year and that 20 of us at least would go. So I'd sort of got my foot in the door and just arrived at university. And so it was an important stage. And so I decided to work very hard for my exams. I remember coming home in the Easter holidays and actually did a timetable for myself, and I worked in the morning, had lunch, an hour's break, and then worked in the afternoon throughout the whole holidays. And it's been something that stood me in good stead, really, because I recognised that you couldn't just do it all at the end. So probably over-prepared and came top of the year, which wasn't planned, but it meant I got through, but we did lose 20 people.
Yes, and when you did your PhD, what did you do it on?
Right, so when I did my PhD, it was a unit that was looking at prevention of tooth decay and looking at development of toothpaste. And I was looking, in my PhD, I was looking at the design of clinical trials of caries dental decay prevention. And we were also looking at the different fluoride strengths in toothpaste. So one of the outcomes of my work was identifying that a lower fluoride toothpaste was not as efficient at preventing decay as a sort of 1,000 parts per million. So subsequently, it contributed to the evidence base to standardise the level of fluoride in toothpaste across Europe, and now it's a minimum of 1,000 ppm, to get prevention of tooth decay.
What happened after the PhD?
Well, I was in Manchester because I did my PhD there, and I carried on working with that group and working in paediatric dentistry and working more towards what was beginning then dental public health. And I worked with the North West Regional Health Authority, becoming a dental epidemiologist, so surveying children's health really, so that we could look and monitor how their dental health was and look at the impacts of different interventions that we were trying. And it was the beginning of the national programme for having surveys at local level. Up until that time, there'd just been the national surveys every 10 years, so that you couldn't say it was going on a particular district, but you could talk about England or the north of England compared to the south, or Wales. So really big geographic areas, whereas the people in charge of services wanted to know what was going on, wanted to compare, Birmingham and Dudley or Manchester and Liverpool, and you couldn't do that. So those sort of local surveys that we worked on, and I was part of the team that developed those, became coordinated by our specialist association, which is the British Association for the Study of Community Dentistry, and they continue to this day really, and have provided a tremendous evidence base for us of dental health of our child population.
I should again take you back slightly, because you were 29 when
I was 29 when I got my PhD.
There can't be many women who got some PhDs at that time. There can't be many women of colour in Britain at that time in the PhD, which is really, really unusual.
Yeah. Yes, I think, as we were saying before, in a way, you don't have the perspective at the time. You just do each step, and sometimes your career develops more by opportunities that occur, whether you're able to take them up. So yes, it was unusual, and it was only years later really that a colleague called Nicola Rollock was looking at professors, black women or women of Caribbean or African heritage in the UK who'd become professors, and this was 2018, 2019, so many years later. And they were just 25. So, and of course we were all scattered all over the UK, so you tended not to have a peer group. You didn't actually know people like you. And that was only something I came to recognise after a time. When my research took me to America, and I visited Howard University, which is one of the universities that was set up in the United States to allow the children of slaves to learn to become doctors and dentists. So Howard University is the faculty of black or mixed race. So suddenly I had a peer group of people that looked like me, and I still visit now, and I'm going next month. So that gave me friendships that I wouldn't have had really. So I think you find peers and mentors that can provide the support you need at different times in your life.
And eventually, you went to Scotland. Yes.
So that was in '92 when.
With 2 children.
I had 2 children. Yes, yes, 2 children, 2 girls, and I got my senior lectureship in Dundee, which was a long way north,
Right,
the
very
northeast,
far north,
and ended up spending 10 years there, and it was the most productive time, and I made some tremendous friends, and had a good time, really. We did some really important research, and made some great colleagues, and I went up from senior lecturer to reader, and then I got a personal chair, became professor in Dundee in 2001, and I was then a consultant in dental public health as well. So I'd sort of gone up both. As academic dentist, you have two pathways really. So one is the pathway, the clinical pathway. So you're going from house office, senior house officer, registrar, consultant, and then the academic pathways, lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, consultant, professor. So you end up as professor consultant. Yeah. So I'd married a Mancunian, and we'd been in Scotland for 10 years, and it really needed to get back really to Manchester for him, or back to the northwest. So there were no jobs going at the time, so I thought I'll write to both deans, which I did. I wrote to the dean at the dental school at Liverpool and one at Manchester and said, hello, might you have something going? And the timing was good, and I was actually appointed into Liverpool in 2002, and then the following year I was asked to go forward to be considered for dean, and was appointed as the first woman to be dean of a dental school in the UK in 2003.
It was a tremendous achievement.
Well, it was sort of amazing, really. It was a
Yes.
fantastic 5 years I had as dean, and it was a good time to be a dean because it was a time of expansion. There was new money. We actually put in a bid to the Department of Health and got additional student numbers, so we were able to extend the building, put in new facilities, and it was very productive and very different from working with a research group, because when you're working with a research group, the organisation's very flat, so everybody works together as a team, really. There's no hierarchy involved, each bring your own discipline. But in a dental school, as being the dean, you have positional authority, which, as you'll know, as a head, it means you can do things, you can actually bring forward your ideas, you work with people, but you set up teams, you know, and you can really make a difference. So that was a tremendous experience, really, and I felt very honoured to be able to do that. And then towards the end of that, I think probably I got this amazing letter home, and my husband phoned me and said, this letter's arrived. I didn't know, you know what it is.
Yes.
And you think it's a hoax at first, don't you?
Yes, absolutely.
And you know, the Queen is minded to award you a CBE, so I was awarded a CBE by the Queen in the Birthdays Honours list. Yeah.
And you've got the CBE with you?
I have, yes. I bought it because we were showing the pupils today, weren't we? Yes,
it's glorious, isn't it? Lovely.
Absolutely. So it's a.
Can you see that?
It is an absolute wonder, really.
And you've been all over the world with your
I have,
career,
with my
haven't you?
research, yes.
Yeah.
I've been very lucky. I worked for 10 years as a director of the WHO Collaborating Centre when I was in Liverpool.
Right.
And my research has taken me literally all over the world.
But WHO, World Health Organisation.
Yes, that's right, the World Health Organisation, yeah.
Yeah.
So my research has really taken me everywhere. I've even been to Siberia, which is just an amazing experience.
What on earth were you doing in Siberia?
Well, we were asked to look at a potential study site there, and it was so different. It was extraordinary. It's like going back to look at Dr. Zhivago.
I can imagine.
Amazing. I spent some time in Moscow. And, I've been then when I continued my academic journey and was appointed Dean of Health at the University of Salford, a very different university, and really a great experience to be involved in overseeing and supporting the whole range of the health professionals. And then I became Pro Vice-Chancellor there, and one of my tasks as Pro Vice-Chancellor was to promote the international agenda for the university, and that was across all disciplines really, so I worked with engineering and business studies and so on. We went to Vietnam and to Hong Kong and to India to look at different partnerships we could set up for the university. So my work there took me beyond dentistry really. Then in the dental field I was president of my specialty organisation and then Secretary General of a research organisation. And so I was all over Europe and North America. And I've been very, very fortunate. Had an amazing career and been very lucky.
And can we conclude then by, can I ask you the question that was asked this morning in Assembly? What's the one piece of advice you might give to young people?
Yes.
that are starting out on their careers, or just perhaps even just choosing a career?
Yes, I think probably, as I was saying, is keep going really. We all have setbacks, and seeking help when you need it and not being afraid to ask for help, that's really important. And if you fail an exam, as I did once, learning from that. You can learn an awful lot from when you don't pass something, and not giving up and following through what you enjoy doing. And if you're not in the right place and don't feel that you can grow in the place that you are, to change and to move. And for young women to say you can do it.
And Cynthia, can I just say it's been an absolute pleasure meeting you today, and thank you so much for coming. You know, I really enjoyed it. I know the pupils have benefited greatly from your advice. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute delight to come back after all these years.